Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Debbie Kemp. I'm the head of membership at Amber and BGA, and a very big welcome today to our latest podcast to David and to Helmut, who are going to be talking through their latest book. And I'm going to literally hand straight over to them. I've had the pleasure of reading the book, but we're literally going to walk through the book with you all, which I'm sure you will find of great interest. But before we get into talking about your latest book, could you please just share with us your story about how you both met? Because I've had the pleasure of hearing that story. But please, over to you, Helmut.
Yeah, basically, I met David, as I just learned, it was 2004. Is that correct, David? 2004? And I was looking actually for a position in trading. And I was really desperate because I had so many interviews, and sometimes happens you interview a candidate and like 5 minutes in, this is never going to work out, but then you're going to be very polite for another 55 minutes and basically, oh, it was really nice meeting you. We'll think about that. And I basically went through 10 interviews, and then finally David came in with his very British humor influenced by the American vibe and his background, and I figured that should work out. And like 1 hour into the conversation, I realized, yes, he's the candidate. I liked his background, I liked his attitude. And so, yes, 3 months later, he started working for BP, and I'm never looking back. I think he did a great job. And out of that work relationship created a friendship that lasted so many years. David, your angle on it.
Well, yes, I mean, my strategy of trying to serve up 10 candidates that I knew would fail clearly worked. So I'm happy that my friends went and interviewed with Helmut and bored him. I think, you come across people in your careers that you just seem to click with. And I was fortunate with Helmut that he and I seemed to sort of fit together nicely, that we would sort of complete thoughts that were otherwise incomplete. And I think that was something that was intuitive, instinctive. We come from different parts of the world, but yet somehow we fit together. And we worked together since 2004, as Helmut says, although he did try and send me to different parts of the world. Every time that I had a new assignment, it was, well, I now need you to go to this part of the world or that part of the world. So I did get something of a complex that he was trying to get rid of me somehow. But between Houston, Chicago, Mumbai, Abu Dhabi, and a short stint in London, we completed some pretty extraordinary projects around the company and around the world. And through that, our friendship grew. So when COVID hit and we both hung up our hats at BP, we talked about how we would continue our collaboration, what we would work on together. It seemed like our working relationship and the way that we tackled problems was just too good to let it somehow slide by. So we came up with the concept of trying to write books that would take the wisdom that was available and perhaps a little of our own, sprinkle a little of our own in there, and try and present it for a new audience, an audience that we felt that was underserved by business literature, leadership literature, and specifically career advice, something that we felt we knew quite a bit about. So that's how we came to be sitting in front of you now, actually having just on the precipice of the launch of our second book. Who would have thought it? But here we are.
Fantastic, thank you, and hence why it's a great pleasure to have you on our podcast today, because obviously talking about careers and also your book covers leadership is very relevant to our audience of business leaders who are studying for MBAs and other business degrees in our Amber and BGA accredited schools. But also I'm sure many of our business school faculty will also listen into this podcast and certainly find the insights that you cover very relevant to the roles that they do in advising our students. And I love the backstory because you obviously met at a job interview for BP, a big corporate, and that's really where this second book starts off, doesn't it? A Groundhog Career. your second book, and it starts off with an assessment centre. So I thought that was so relevant that, you know, that's where you both met, in a big corporation, and obviously have forged this wonderful partnership and collaboration since then. So could you perhaps maybe tell me a little bit more about about the book? You start off with I loved the fact it was in 2 parts. I loved the story of Shay going to his assessment centre and basically having this Groundhog Day experience. So could you maybe share a little bit more about your inspiration for Shay and his character?
Yeah, I'd love to. We started off very much, I mean, it was quite a conscious effort to think about how to make the book distinctive, how to present it for an audience that we thought was underserved. And we've, over the years, very much valued storytelling as a central way to convey ideas in accessible ways, but also in amusing and entertaining ways. The adage goes something along the lines of that you don't necessarily always remember exactly what was said, but you remember how you felt when you were in a particular situation. And so we felt that we wanted to try and marry storytelling with some underlying strong messages and lessons with our academic roots. We've both studied for our doctorate, and so we've done all the research, and in that sense we're sort of semi-academic in the sense of how we approach these subjects. And so we wanted to bring these two sides together, if you will, the left and the right brain. So that was the basic premise, and then the idea of how you present this dilemma that we have. The statistics on this are quite staggering. That the CIPD found 90% of people were disengaged with their jobs in the last 12 or 24 months. Most of the other research, the big research center Gallup, is suggesting that 60% are disillusioned, but a quite scary 20% find their work a source of misery in their lives. And so you look at these statistics and say there's something wrong with employment or work, or the sense that we have to sacrifice, that we somehow have to pay a price for our work. And drawing through, well, what's the underlying issues going on here? The story of A Groundhog Day just seemed like a lovely way to tell that story. How is it that we get trapped in this sort of repetitive prison cell that we've created for ourselves, where the circle goes something along the lines of, I have bills to pay, therefore I have to go to work to earn a salary to pay the bills, but I don't know that I'm enjoying this, so there's no joy in it. And the question becomes, well, why is that? Why do we do that to ourselves? Why do we tell ourselves it's necessary? And the story of A Groundhog Career just lent itself to that. And we sort of take snippets of experiences that we've had throughout our own careers or we've observed and embellish them for purposes of storytelling. And the Shay Sinope character is something that we invented for the first book, and then we're continuing into book 2. So in book 2, The Groundhog Career, is Shay believing that his life is all about getting the next promotion, something that I think is familiar to many of us, that if he's really collapsed his telescope of time or meaning to this one event that he must achieve, that everything in his life is surrounding this. He goes through the assessment center and it doesn't quite work out how he expects. And so then we tell the story of how through failure and reinvention and constantly trying to relive this day, ultimately he learned some lessons about whether that was the most productive, well, not productive, but the most fulfilling component. And what we're trying to draw out here is the frustration that we all feel with aspects of work being a necessity, feeling like we're obligated, and to try and strip away how much of that have we invented ourselves, how much of that are we projecting, either because we think that the world expects it of us, or we've told ourselves that that's our identity, that's who we are, that's what we have to do. And trying to unpick that a little bit and ask deeper questions about, well, are we really ignoring the alternatives? And there are many. particularly in this day and age. So I'll pause at that juncture. I don't know, giving away aspects of the story,
People need to buy the book.
Yeah.
Exactly. I want to protect. I mean, the whole point of the story is to make it a surprising and interesting thing. You get the gist of it from a career Carol, from A Groundhog Career, but the idea of what actually happens to him and what he finds out is something that we think is a fun thing that we'd like to try and protect for readers.
No, absolutely. And I think he's such an interesting character, and yet as a reader of the book, I think there's a lot of opportunity to reflect on your own individual journey and where you've maybe had similar feelings and insecurities or drives to do things or pressures from other people. And I think that makes it such a compelling read, because you can see yourself in some part reflected in what you're reading. Was that your purpose, Helmut, in terms of your style?
Well, basically what you say is very true, because every dimension of the book, be it career, private life, personal life, is informed by parts of our lives. It's either David, it's either myself. Every character has basic dimensions of us, and I think that's very important. And the important thing about the books is, because we've not really touched on that, when David and I, set out to write books, we said, well, we have probably read 1,000 books between the two of us, probably more, on leadership, on careers, and we realized, probably we have not finished every book, because it's always more of the same. It's normally 260, 300 pages. It's too much detail. And we thought it'd be really nice to be very practical and bring things to life. And so we have 5 dimensions in the book. And that's basically from book 1 to 2 to book 3, which is on Amazon online already now. And it's basically, firstly, we're going to have a story. So that's Shay. Then we basically have a part which is advice and really practical things, that's the book on leadership. We use images because we think in images, and so we try to have drawings to underpin the story. Then basically what we also do for the lazy reader, I call it the lazy reader, every chapter has a chapter blink, and for the very lazy, it always has 3 highlights. So basically, if you don't want to read 265 pages, you might as well just read 8 pages. And the last thing, the 5th uniqueness of the book, is that we bring in external people. We call them collaborators. And in this book, they tell their story. So we have 6 people from different walks of life who tell their story and bring the book alive. And I think that's what's so different about every book. And I think, if you're lucky, we can create a new category of book writing. And as you can see, the cover of the book is very colorful, very engaging, and I think it's a beautiful product.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's memorable for those reasons. I think the story stays with you. I love it even at the end where you suggest, is there more to Shay's story? Is there a romance? And I liked that touch at the end. See, I did read the whole book just to prove my point.
Oh, yes.
But equally, I enjoyed the fact, particularly in part 2, as you say, where you actually are offering some suggestions which are very grounded in research. And again, that appealed to me as an academic. And you come up with some great stats. And you take us on a journey as well. I loved the part where you take us on a leadership journey all the way from Plato to Drucker. You literally summarize all the different leadership styles and come up with some really powerful suggestions of self-reflection and through those blink summaries, which I again enjoyed. Without giving too much away, would you be prepared just to sort of share maybe a few teasers in terms of some of those suggestions in part 2?
Well, part 2 has sort of three distinct components we pull apart three things. The first is game playing. And so this is the central premise of the book in a way, which is that in our early parts of our careers, the temptation is to reduce complex systems using heuristics, to simplify them into something like a game. We talk a lot about gamification in a different context to try and make things appealing. The same is true. We're fans of Daniel Kahneman and the sort of thinking fast and thinking slow methodology, and the idea that how we relate to something, how we frame it, has profound impact on how we interact with it. So when we tell ourselves in our early careers, particularly in the first 10 or 15 years, that we're desperate to establish ourselves, the temptation is to reduce the systems that we encounter. And actually, in a way, we're not sole conspirators here. We have people who contribute to this by creating systems in companies and being told, well, this is how things work in this company, and just play the game. And so it's tempting to reduce the ultimate intent to just a series of tactical, like game theory type things that enable you to get where you want to go. You collapse all of these systems to say, well, how do I get promotion faster? How do I get a bigger pay rise? And how do I, get a leadership position, as if that's some form of recognition? So what we're trying to pick out in the second part are the three underpinning traps, if you will. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about career traps. And the first is, if we reduce our professions, our careers to a game, then there's a danger we get trapped in the game. The game becomes our career. We end up running faster and faster on a somewhat unfulfilling treadmill. So the first component that we unpick in part two is this game playing component, about how it works, how it's a natural aspect of human evolution, how our brains process information, particularly lots of information. And we need to be careful and conscious, and we're often not. I mean, let's be very honest with ourselves. When we go to work, very often we're not thinking deeply about how today relates to the week, to the month, to the year, or to that matter, to a 40-year time span. We're tending to think about things in much narrower and shorter timeframes. How do I get through this meeting? How do I get to the next evaluation that I'm due to get? How do I get the better ranking and the better bonus? It tends to get collapsed into those things. So we unpick why that happens. It's a natural thing. It's not unnatural. If anyone's listening to the podcast that says, oh gosh, that's me and I thought I was weird, you're not. This is exactly how everyone to some extent processes their early careers. And so we want to try and say, look, let's give one another permission to admit that this is very often how we relate to things, and then work through how we might be able to escape that, how we might be able to hold that in a healthier balance. Because we're not necessarily saying game playing is completely unhelpful. We're not saying that it's something we should avoid. It's just that we have to have a healthy perspective about. We talk about consequences quite a bit when we're writing these books. We're saying that very often it's about choices and consequences. And so there is a consequence to the choice to collapse things into the short timeframes of the quantitative aspects of our careers, of how we get more. The second component that we unpick is how our environment creates these pressures on us. There's a lot written at the moment about things like bore out and quiet quitting, and how the environment that we find ourselves in pushes us into situations where we feel trapped, and we're not sure where to escape. And so we start to try in that second section to say, again, this is looking at the world, trying to take down the facade and say, okay, here's what's really going on. So in that second section, what we point to is the societal pressures, the recent history, going back to the Protestant work ethic and the idea of the labor movements, and how we have been, to some extent, brought up in an environment where there is an expectation that you must suffer for work, that a degree of sacrifice is required. And we start asking the question, well, how much of that have we invented for ourselves, and how much of that is actually necessary? So the second part of the second section of part 2 is talking about those. And then the third one is we talk about leadership, because in a way it's linked to things like quiet quitting and bore out, where we say the quality and standard of leadership is to some extent an artifact of the people who have been appointed to those positions. And many of the modern corporations blur the line between leadership as a reward for good performance, as opposed to leadership as an activity, something that we do in order to achieve a desirable outcome. And so what we try and point out in that leadership side is that if we get trapped in an organization where leadership is purely a reward, and to some extent we persuade ourselves that that's how we're going to relate to it, it's a status, then we end up contributing to an environment where the people around us end up suffering more than they should. And it's counterproductive. Ultimately, the most powerful organizations in the world really tap into this notion that we're working together for a shared outcome. Leadership is more about the vision to be able to see a path to that shared outcome and to help people achieve their part of it, rather than to be the person in the corner office with the big business cards and the nice company car and the executive perks, which, as I say, is again easy to point to and harder to understand how to unpick. So that's the final part of the third piece, which sits on top of this story that we've already talked about.
Yeah, can I just basically add something? Because I really believe, in essence, we want to have readers who basically benefit and basically say, well, that really helped me to figure out what I want to do in life and what I want to do with my career. As we speak today, I had a ping coming in, and it's a son of somebody who worked with me in BP. And the guy must be like 20, early 20s. Said, can we have a career conversation? I need some help. And I do realize many people in their 20s need some help, because they're torn between, I want to make a quick career because I want a financial independence, or basically our next chapter is basically, well, I want to have a career as my parents because that's what they want me to do. And there's just not deep reflection. What do I want? And the choice between, yes, I want to have a certain financial independence, but equally, I want to do something which is meaningful to me. And I think that currently no books out there that help people to really figure out what is my North Star, how do you have a navigation system to go through the system. And they're really interesting story. When I started my career with BP in Austria. I'm originally from Vienna. My boss, who was teaching at my boss in Austria, and he was a professor. He taught at Ashridge College. He was Austrian, but he was very Anglophile. He basically said, be very, very aware that when you go to England, when you work in the corporate head office, the quality of your dinner speech is as important, or probably more important, than the work you do. And this is still resonating with me, because that's what the career game is all about. Yeah? When you look about how many people coming from very prestigious schools, they volunteer for every cocktail, they volunteer for every presentation. And, I've seen so many young people who are really eloquent. Yeah? They use language, they don't even know what they're saying. So my key question to people is always, well, what does it actually mean, what you're saying? And how does it actually work in practice? And you realize many people are so good in networking, in giving speeches, they forget to develop the underpinning substance. And this, to get the balance right, is something which is very important to us, and obviously to our readers as well.
Yeah, no, that I think, following on from that, Helmut, I think what is very interesting is this mixed generations that are now in the workplace. And as you pointed out there, I see many of our students, particularly if you're a student studying for an MBA, where you're probably mid-career or senior in your career, and possibly going back into lifelong learning and education to really take the opportunity to self-reflect on where are you and what's my purpose and what do I value in life. But we also have students, as you mentioned there, people younger people going into their first careers, the Gen Zers who have different values, have a different sense of worth, and you've got all of these individuals working together alongside each other. So I think there's multiple dilemmas here in terms of leading across generations, and how can you as a leader motivate and support. Yeah, and any sort of views on that you've I know you explore some of these things in the book, but what's your take on that?
Can I kick it off? And David might have a slightly different take on that. So the last chapter of part 2 is about leadership, and we basically have the premise. In the past, you basically were very hierarchical, command and control. Our belief is, or my belief is, it's impossible. And I've said that to so many leaders. You cannot even control your 2 children. Why do you believe you can control an organization with 10, 20, 50, 100,000 people? Impossible. It just doesn't work. Yeah. And however, I do agree. I think generations have different expectations how to lead and how to be led. And I think as we talk now about the 20-somethings, we should not forget, some of their behaviors is simply function of age. And if you step back, our dreams, expectations when we were 20 was probably very different from what is now. It's called evolution. You get more pragmatic, more practical. You realize the world is not black and white, but it's a shade of colors or gray. And so on leadership, I think the key thing is, and this is for me really the most important thing, like leaders and team members need to develop one skill, and that's listening and trying to be in the shoes of the speaker. And I think we've become very bad listeners. I think we've become very, very bad in communicating. But if the different generations at work, and sometimes we have like 3 or sometimes even 4 generations at work, listening is the superpower for everyone. And I know there's a lot of negativity around, like the next generation of 20-somethings. People say they want to work from home, they just don't want to work at all, they're lazy. This is not and I think it's not our experience at all. I think we have a very, very highly educated generation coming up. They're probably much broader because they have like internet, they have like TikTok, they have many sources of information. And I was always very impressed by my young nephew when he was really, really young. He asked me a question, and of course I know that. And I saw him under the table just Googling what I was just telling him, just to basically increase his knowledge on that. And I think that's what the key thing is in organizations. People need to understand, leaders need to understand, I cannot control my people. Secondly, I need to get them much better. That's so important. You need to understand what's going on in people's life. Otherwise, you do not understand how you can basically deliver their potential to the fullest. I think that is very important. But equally, I think sometimes, and I think I have some very young people working for me in some of my startups, they like guidance. They don't like to be too much space. The clearer you are, the politically straight you are with your messages, the better it is. So to every leader, every organization, have the conversation, listen carefully, and we basically have a concept we call adult level conversation. I think that's very important. Take the hierarchy out, because you're twice somebody's age doesn't mean that you know more. We do believe that 2 brains are always smarter than 1 brain. And I think if leaders can actually step into the space that my 20-year-old assistant or trainee can as much or has as much to offer as I do, the magic starts occurring. And that's what we really like to do in our books. Yeah? We really want to have each generation to really, really understand how can I be better. We have huge productivity issues in corporations across the globe, in particular in Europe and in Britain. And I really do believe that, and I go into politics a bit, I think the Trump presence in America is the biggest opportunity for Europe to reset the way they want to run the continent. And I consider UK in that context as part of Europe. But I think it will take an act of leadership, both from the next generation, but also from our generation, really. You can see I feel very passionate about that. David, anything?
And thank you for including the UK and Europe. Thank you.
Can't escape the geography. I echo what Helmut has just said. I think that there's an issue with the question in a way, which is that the idea of what is leadership, if it starts with the premise of I have been appointed the leader of this organization, now how should I, and Helmut used the word control or direct, there are problems with this in the current context and as our workplace is changing. So while we witness changes in the workplace all the time. They're often very small, so you don't see them every day. But if you go back 20 years, the organization would have felt very different to how it feels today. If we fast forward another 20 years, we'll see some other significant and profound changes. One of them we predict is that this hierarchical legacy that we have of cascading in organizations, which are designed, going back to Weber's time with the idea of the ideal bureaucracy, a lot of that stuff now I'm not sure is as necessary as it was. There are many ways to engage people in context to give information. We worked with a retired general in the US military called Stan McChrystal, and he talked about his strategy in Iraq and his strategy in Afghanistan. And he talked about how technology was allowing him increasingly to flatten out the structure so that all of his military teams could get the same information at the same time. There didn't need to be a cascade. And if you're seeing that happening in the military context, then the idea of it being we typically expect corporate organizations to be ahead of that. So as we look at leadership, just to sort of contrast what Helmut was talking about, is that we also have to come to terms with the very foundation of how hierarchies were built in organization is eroding. Gary Hamel talks about this with Management 2.0 and all of the extraordinary costs that the current organizations carry because of the administrative burden of management. Now, we're not attacking management, we're not attacking leadership. What we're simply saying is that the context for the old style of leadership, where one is appointed the boss of a group of people with a budget and an expectation of delivering some sort of results, with the boss as the hero or heroine of the day or the year, that I think is changing. Generation Z are joining the workforce with an expectation that simply being appointed the leader is insufficient justification to order them around. We don't know that that's a bad thing. We think that to some extent is a precursor of how the organization is changing. There needs to be more than simply a business card. This is something we refer to as the legitimate power of a business card, as opposed to reverential power or expert power or some other power that says, actually what we're trying to do is solve this consequential problem, and for people then to see that as an act of leadership. The vision to say we're trying to solve this disease, or we're trying to solve if a wealth disparity, or we're trying to fight for justice, or we're trying to fight for some other problem, water supply, or whatever the things are that we're trying. Climate would be the classic one, and that's what we're in service of. And when I think when we boil it down, one of the most consequential acts that we can make in the capacity of leaders is to take those big visions and link them to the day-to-day tasks. If we are able to present to a Gen Z audience the reason why turning up for a meeting and listening to a 3-hour conference call would lead to solving climate change, then I think we would have big breakthroughs. The problem is a lot of this stuff seems very abstract, and it's hard to get, I find it hard to get enthusiastic about some of these tasks. So goodness knows what the Gen Z audience think about.
Yeah, yeah. And I know something you discuss is around, having that purpose, having the value, so that the people can tap in and be motivated by that, which I think, again, is really interesting. One of the stories that most resonated with me was the story around Daniel wanting to be a diplomat when he was 11 years old, and you do these snippets, as you said, of stories, real life stories, and it really struck me about what would your younger self, when you reflect back on yourself as a child, would they approve of the career choices you've made? And as I was sitting reading your book, as a child, I always wanted to be a teacher, and I didn't start out doing that. I went into a corporate job, worked in a very large retailer in the UK, worked my way up. But actually, when I had the opportunity to pause and have a career break, I then went into teaching. So that, to me, that was very personal to my story. Do you mind if I ask you, what did you want to do when you were young boys? Would your younger selves approve of where you are now? Helmut?
Well, basically, if you ask me like at 14, 15, 16, there were two things. One thing is I firmly believed I would be an Olympic champion in swimming. That's what I did. My coach swam at the Rome Olympics. So there was no doubt, that I would do that. For that purpose, I went to America when I was 16. And the other thing is that actually this is really about writing. When I was like 14, 15, 16, 17, even younger, there are two things I really enjoyed apart from swimming, and that was reading and writing. And I had many of the teachers who said I'm very artistic. I was good at drawing, not so good at playing piano, not so good at singing, but they all agreed that my writing, they enjoyed what I wrote and how I wrote it. And so my younger self would definitely approve of my writing. I'm not sure if my younger self could even comprehend why I went into the corporate career for like 30 plus years. But and David and I have this conversation quite often. I think we would not be able, and I would not be able to do what I currently do without actually basically my time in BP and other corporate jobs, because you really understand the world in a far more cohesive and joined up way. I think we would not be able to write the books the way we write them, and understand how the world works without this corporate exposure. So I think my 16-year-old self would probably be pretty much okay with my life.
Good.
David? You never told me this story, so that's good very good question, Debbie.
But in a way, I think I've already told you it, because A Career Carol, which is the book that I'm sure Debbie is now going to go and read after having read A Groundhog Career. Shay's monologue in the first part of A Career Carol is sort of modeled on my own teenage angst, which is that I used to have relatives say to me, so what are you going to do with the rest of your life? And, what are you going to make of yourself? And I always found it a very intimidating question, to be honest. Perhaps unlike Helmut, I wasn't going to be an Olympic swimmer. I love to play sports, but I wasn't gifted enough in any one of them to feel like I could make a living from it. Occasionally, I dreamed of somehow this, which all kids do to some extent, I suppose, of how could I create something that's sporty and make a living out of it. And so I occasionally thought that, being a PE teacher would have been great or something like that. But it didn't seem like an adequate answer to the question, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? And it's interesting how relatives frame that question, because it feels kind of accusatory. It feels like, okay, what are you doing sitting there? Why haven't you gone and done something consequential? And so my response, unlike Helmut's, was to sort of withdraw. So I found myself in my teenage years sort of drifting a little bit, thinking, I don't really have, there's no force inside me that's trying to escape, that says it's going to invent something or change the world. I just kind of feel like I'm just an average kid who's getting, slightly better than average grades at school. I'm just going to see where this takes me. And so I fell into corporate life, not because I had any conscious belief that that's what I was destined to do, but to be brutally honest, because I wasn't sure what else I could do. And so mine was very much a voyage of discovery. I think if I look back and say at the age of 15 or 16, how would I have predicted or how would I have scripted it? I would have gone, I had no script, I had no story. I took one step and that led to another step. And the analogy I always give is that sort of I was in a room with lots of closed doors, and I didn't know what was behind the doors. So I just picked one at random and walked through it. And you know what? There was another room with more doors. So I just kept opening doors. And then ultimately the rooms got bigger and bigger and I could see more and more. So in that sense, I don't think my 16-year-old self could comprehend where I've ended up progressing. The truth I tell myself is that each time I've walked through a door, I've gone, okay, how can I make this room even bigger? What can I go and do that would be beyond this? And my imagination starts to shift a little bit, and I see more possibilities. So I think Helmut's answer is much better than mine.
No, just one thing, and this is really, I think David and I complement each other extremely well. There's enough probably tension in our view of the world, but I think we probably have 70 to 80% shared beliefs of the world and leadership and companies. And I think that is quite important, yeah. Because many people ask, why do you write a book with somebody else? Firstly, I do believe, I was in the army for a period of time, and the general at the time said, one person, one man is a coward, two make heroes. And, when you think about that, sometimes people say things to you when you're young and you have no clue why they say that, what it means. But as you progress through life, you realize this is so true. And it's just the most enjoyable thing I've done in a very long time, to write books with David.
And that's, I think, very evident from this conversation. And again, maybe another great lesson to learn, that it's wonderful as you walk through your career to collect inspiring people and have them surround you, even perhaps after you finish working with them. And again, that's something you reflect on in the book, about having a collection of trusted people who will be honest with you, who will push you, inspire you. And I've certainly been very fortunate in my varied careers that I've had that opportunity to have some great mentors and great coaches. Again, have you got, aside from each other, do you have those sort of inspirational people that you still consider to be your mentors today?
Yes, I mean, obviously, Helmut and I spend an awful lot of time debating some really wild and wacky ideas. Some of it's related to the book, some of it's just for the heck of having a sounding board. I think that's right. The rich tapestry that comes from diversity of views, which is complex in today's world, where there's such angst and such divisiveness in polarization is the word I was looking for, where people start to shy away from that. So I think having a diversity of views in a true sense of a spectrum of perspectives is useful. And I think the thing that I've collected over the years that I value the most is that through my various academic pursuits, I've retained contact with some of the faculty that were kind in coaching me and encouraging me, both through my MBA and my doctorate, that still even now will respond to an email or occasionally have a cup of coffee. And I find that very comforting comforting in a way, but also reassuring, because it's nice to get those perspectives. And then from a business standpoint, as we've gone around the world and completed projects, I'm happy to say that, you know, that the process of helping other people solve problems, which is largely what Helmut and I did for 40 years, help people solve problems, very often not of our own making, but of someone else's making, to try and unpick that and find a path to make the problem less severe or to solve it. You know, you pick up those relationships, and those relationships stay with you. They're not without some effort. It's not, you don't sit there and they just magically continue. So you have to make an effort. So when we travel around or haven't contacted people for a while, I find myself reaching out. So I love the people we met in India. They have been inspiring, and their perspective of the world, looking at the established Western economies from an Indian standpoint, is extraordinarily interesting and rewarding and different. But it also reveals some good and bad things about the way that the Western business world works. And a lot of the people at BP who are incredibly talented and have gone on to do great things. And then in my early career, I was in consulting. And so a lot of us in those first 10 or 15 years I was in consulting have gone on to work for big corporates. Some have gone into academia. And so keeping in contact with them has been useful. So you do pick up this, we used to call it a Rolodex, didn't we? I don't know what we call it now, you know, a set of contacts in your phone. But that is rewarding on two levels, it seems to me. The first is they are friends, so it's fun to catch up with them. But secondly, their perspectives add a sort of rich layer. But the final thing I would add is you have to sort of be vulnerable with them. And this is the thing that I think people find most difficult, which is that it's one thing catching up for a cup of coffee. It's another thing confessing that you're struggling with something. And we have such a stigma about being able to admit that we're not failing at something, but we're struggling with something. I would encourage people to try and find that network that they're comfortable being vulnerable with, because the greatest value, the greatest benefit of having friends that can provide you with those solutions is being able to confess to them that you need help.
Thank you.
Well said, David. I'm not sure what I should add to that. It's very good. I fully agree with that. I think it's a great thing to basically keep people in your life that have known you for a long time. I think it's very, very stressful to tell your story to new people all the time. Stick with the people who've been with you for a long period of time. I think that's important. And yes, in my life, there are probably 3-4 people I pick up the phone to and say, well, just can you give me your really honest view? I think the next generation, many people you see in our books featured, some of them are much younger than we are, but I love the ability to give me unfiltered feedback where something, is that, did you just say what I think you said? But, you know, it's so important in life to have a great mirror that does a reflection not of you, the way you would like to see yourself, but how your environment actually does see you. So yes, I think it's very important also to focus this group, because I think you cannot. I think it's really difficult to have more than 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 really, really deep, honest, authentic relationships. So it takes time. I think it takes a lot of time, but I also believe it's time well spent. And as our audience, as you said, is probably in the 20s, 30s, and the faculty, it is very, very important to basically listen to people from all generations in a very, very honest and authentic way, because that's actually at the end of the day which moves you forward.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a great place to conclude. It's been wonderful spending this hour with you and get a sense of your collaboration and your friendship, and also to have had the pleasure of reading your book, which I would genuinely highly recommend wherever you are in your career journey. There's lots of food for thought, lots of self-reflection, and lots of tips on how to be brave and maybe change the direction if you are in that Groundhog Day career trap that some people might find themselves in. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll stay connected, and I look forward to your next collaboration and your next book. So thank you very much, gents.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.